about the topic or make some comments within 3 minutes. Then how about Miss Lu? Miss Lu first. Okay.
Okay, I think thank you very much for the introduction and for everyone online. I suppose that the online guests will got the first chance, but I'm very happy that Mr. Zhou gave me the chance. Just at this morning, I talked about the open source and the IP, especially for the patent protection conflict and how we can balance the patents and the balance of the patents protection and the open source. So, but finally, I just took with me the notes. Why I do remember one wording. I forgot which experts talk about during the today, but he shared one wording. I do take the notes, collaborating on the platform and the competition on the products. I think this word is very good for the open source hardware because everyone will think about that. We need to have the open source technology to help for the invention can be easy access and be helpful for everyone. But anyway, we still need to have a society that will consider about the business interests. We must have some of the collaboration on the platform, and then we will have the competition on the products in any way. We still have the competition. I think that's the motivation of the society. So based on this, I just wanted to tell everyone a story about what I have met. I just traveled from Shanghai to Shenzhen on June 21, and because of that time, we still need to get the physical isolation for the people who lived in Shanghai to Shenzhen. Then I met one young engineer. He is really young. And very interesting, I asked why you came to Shenzhen because he has no location, no apartment, even no work or job here in Shenzhen. But he asked his friends to book a hotel for him, but was filled because at that time, all the hotel must be booked through the local government authority because you should be in the isolated person. So then why he came to Shenzhen? He told me that his first major is accounting, but his interest is in the computer science. And he worked in the internet company for around 8 years. But it seems that he only got some of the experience of work. He wanted to get some advanced learning, but no college or university can give him such requirement of learning because he doesn't need any academic degree. He needs to learn some technology. So that's why he asked his friends to ask for an opportunity, can follow with one person in a very famous company. Then he wanted to learn from such of he said that the advanced engineer in this industry. Then he want to stay in Shenzhen for 3 months. That's why even he needs to be it's a very difficult way to travel from Shanghai to Shenzhen. He came. So that seems that for the open source community is very important for everyone. I think lots of the young generation in China, maybe lots of them, their first degree is not related in their job, but they have some interests. They want to learn something more, not only to use the technology, but you can use this opportunity to get your the personal skill or technology can be encouraged. They can have another opportunity. So I think in the future, we will have more and more open source technology communities. That's quite sure. So I think I just wanted to say this. We must have things about the collaboration and the competition and try to get an like IP governance, I cannot say the governing law, but we should have some governing rules or some doctrines that can encourage the sharing of the technology and also encourage people can be beneficial from the open source technology. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Then how about Park?
Hello. Okay, so things that I think might be interesting for people involved in open hardware to be thinking about, as the perspective of somebody who is a patent attorney, but also as somebody who has worked in the semiconductor IP industry for quite a long time. I think there's a lot of value potentially for people involved in open hardware to consider some of the worst case scenarios of what can happen if you don't think about how patents can impact your business, if you are going to have a business revolving around open hardware. In particular, I think it's very important to consider how there may be arising in the future a substantial imbalance in how patents can be asserted between traditional closed hardware systems, or even, of course, patent trolls and open hardware. And I think there are two aspects where this ought to be considered quite carefully by the open hardware community. The first is that the traditional patenting environments, such as closed hardware, may have a very significant advantage in accusing open hardware systems of patent infringement. And that's primarily because of the fact that obviously open hardware will intrinsically have the ability for you to see how everything works, right? You can access the source, you can see the design documents, you will be able to see exactly what your system does and how it operates. That is an intrinsic fundamental tenet of what you're attempting to achieve. But the downside of that is it's much, much, much easier for somebody to accuse you of patent infringement. And I don't think you can underestimate how big an advantage that is for closed hardware systems, particularly in the semiconductor space, where it's very, very difficult for you to really understand how other people's products work. And for patent infringement, to make a good patent infringement case, you need to have a pretty good idea how something operates. So currently, there's always that situation in closed hardware where an awful lot of people probably infringe a lot of patents, but nobody knows because it's all kept under the surface and everyone's fairly unaware of at least they're unaware enough that they wouldn't launch a multi-million-dollar litigation on the back of a hunch of how things work. With open hardware, it's very different. You will be able to build your patent case up and have a very strong idea of infringement well in advance of launching a litigation. And that's particularly problematic for open hardware for two reasons. The one is that it would allow somebody wanting to assert a patent against you to use what could be a relatively narrow patent. It could be one that's not very broad and widely applicable, but is actually quite targeted at what your hardware actually does, because they know you do it. They can see that you do it in the source. And that means that patent is likely to be much stronger and harder to knock out from an invalidity perspective. So that could be problematic. The second part that would be very concerning, only really applies to the US, is continuations. So somebody could look at your hardware and deliberately file continuations from existing patents that push it closer and closer to what your hardware does. That could end up with some really very close patents to your hardware, which would be potentially very concerning. And I think open hardware, and I'll just wrap up now, needs to think about ways that they can start to mitigate against those risks, which is not simple. And maybe that's something we can talk about later. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Then, how about Xianying? Give us your comments about the main topic.
All right. So I'm going to bring to the perspective of the table a couple of things here. I've been working in open source intellectual property for about 20 years. A lot of that's been on copyright, but I was also global director of licensing at Open Invention Network, which is the largest non-aggression tool in history. And I confer with Paul about the Dreadnought play, but I will bring the topic. Software has been far harder, higher in margins than hardware. You make a lot more money in software, and yet around open source, we haven't seen significant litigation at all. In fact, less litigation than proprietary software. Now, that isn't because people are charitable. It's mainly because of the point I made earlier about.
Maybe the voice is not quite clear.
I see. Is this better?
Yes, better.
So the point I made earlier in my speech about the difference between platform and product, I think is probably key to containment of the intellectual property risk. The primary issue that we found with companies litigating has been on the product level. And open source being focused on platform level has by and large circumvented the conflict, regardless of whether the domain was highly patented with current patents or was in largely expired domains such as operating system fundamentals. Ultimately, intellectual property is just a tool. Having copyright or a patent, it's just a tool. It depends on your motivation. Are you taking a defensive stance? Are you monetizing? Are you trying to aggressively prevent competitors? Now, around platform technologies, which is probably where open hardware belongs just as open source software belongs. The primary motivation is to foster collaboration. And therefore, the primary stance of entities at play is defensive rather than monetization or aggression. And even companies which initially took quite aggressive stances, like for instance, Microsoft against the open source software, and in the prior decade, attempts to monetize their patent portfolio. Ultimately, they decided that on platform level technology, collaboration outweighed the value of litigation. So in summary, there are threats to intellectual property. However, if the focus is platform technology, the motivation of parties is not attacking, it's collaboration. And we mustn't discount the fact that it's not as if open hardware is going to be in perfect opposition to proprietary hardware. In practice, most of the proprietary companies will be making open hardware, and therefore will have both motivations at the table to protect their proprietary products, but to benefit from open platforms. So I think there will be an equilibrium found, but it might take some time because it's a new field.
Okay, thank you. Then, how about Mr. Ren to give us your comments? Mr. Ren.
Sorry, everyone. Yes, I'm here. There are some technical problems. I try to fix that. Good afternoon, everyone. I practiced in customs laws and international trade compliance. So I will be paying more attention on the export control of open source hardware. As we all know that in American and also in China, we have some law and regulations about export control, but it's mostly like to control the software and technical of the common goods. I think it's maybe there have a gap, have some gaps about how to control the open source hardware. It's a challenge for the government, not only in China, but also American and other countries. So as a lawyer, we are to I think it's a new area that we must pay more attention and for the every for for the every parties acted in the open source hardware, it's also a serious problem. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, then let's turn to the second part. We should focus on two questions. In fact, there are many questions raised our pre-discussion, but I summarized into two questions. The first question is about how could the IP protection system and the open source license system exist in one system? There must be many problems. And the second question is about how could the industry and also the private firms make use of this new discipline, then to promote the development of technology and to enhance its own competitiveness. Okay, just my main suggestion about the questions in this part, but you can also discuss some specific questions that we have raised in our pre-discussion. Okay, then firstly, I want to invite Cecilia.
I think that I do have when I doing summary of today's my feeling of that the keywords of the collaboration on platform and the competition on the products is quite key for everything when we talk about the rule discussion. And today, because we talked about the classification is very important. So RPC Reals Lab introduced a very helpful information about their RPC. And that has been also, I think, approved by the Red Hat's business model. That means some of the technical side classification is very important. And then based on ORN's introduction, we understand that there's some, I call them a club system. They will help support all their members to defend from the patent infringement. They also help the members to do the patent risk assessment. You know, everyone, if one user or one company, they want to do all the patent analysis by themselves, it's a very huge investment, not only for the money, the human right, but also the time. You have to invest lots of the costs on this. So if we can have a community, if everyone can share their information about the patent they have studied to everyone, that can really helpful for every user. So I think for about the IP, when we talk about the protection, the IP rights, we have to think about the encourage system, how we can develop some of the rules to encourage everyone to share the information. And why I suggest Mr. Zhenhe to join us, because I think the HS code system from the customers can also give us some of the insights when we develop or design the rules. So that's why I think I do not have no more comments, but I would use this chance to ask everyone to have thinking about the labeling system I have mentioned this morning. the RIS lab. I'm just want everyone remember that the logo designed by me. I hope that we can help everyone to have a classification and the labeling system, and then help the risk-5 community can be a really very easy access and the high efficient community. That's it.
Thank you. I think that's really a really a good and a useful suggestion. Thank you. And then, Park, how about your suggestions?
Yes, well, okay. So just coming back to the previous point there, which I thought was very good and very useful. So that concept about patent analysis, understanding the risk, being too hard for one company to do in isolation, I completely agree. It's nigh on impossible for a single company to have any genuine appreciation of what their patent risk actually is for a given product. So anything you can do as a community is enormously helpful, certainly. But there are two things that I think you need to consider. One is always an open-ended question, so that you never know when you've finished. That's the trouble. You could keep looking and looking and looking and looking forever, and you will find things. And you hope you will find most of the things in a given period of time, but you can never be sure that you have found everything, okay? So there is no such thing as guaranteed risk-free. There may still be other things. But the other point is, if you're going to go looking, and you're going to go looking for what your patent risks might be, you are going to find things that are problematic. You will start to find patents out there that are owned by other commercial entities. They may be big players, they may be Intels or ARMs, or they may be small players, they may be universities. There will be things out there that you will find, and you need to have an idea of what you're going to do with that information when you've found it. So what is the goal? Is the goal then to try and design around each of those patents so that you don't infringe them? Or is your goal going to be to build some sort of challenge against that patent so that if you need to knock it out, you can? Or are you going to attempt to obfuscate that feature so that it's hidden in some way how you're implementing it, which is obviously not as much of an option in an open hardware scenario. So I think that's something that's very interesting and a real challenge. I think, obviously the work that's been done already has been fantastic, but it's a big undertaking, and it's not something that is easy to do by any stretch. One other very quick point, your very first question that you mentioned that we should talk about here about IP and open source existing in one system. Okay.
Yes.
My initial thought when you said that is, are they not already in one system? Are they not all based around the concept of IP that is generated, but it's open source is just a question of how that IP is licensed and on what terms? So, I would already say they are one system. They're based around the same foundations, which is IP law. And I think really the question more is, are the licenses that currently are used adequate for the type of things we're now doing? And I don't have an answer for this. I'm not a licensing expert, but certainly, it seems to me that there is often a lack of not necessarily a lack of clarity, but a lack of certainty perhaps in how some open source licenses would be interpreted. And I don't know whether there has been enough of an effort in the open source hardware community to think about what the best licenses you could use would be that would give you that certainty and that comfort that you knew what was going to happen, as opposed to things being perhaps a little bit more uncertain. As I say, I have no answers on that, and I'd be very interested to hear comments from other people.
Okay, thank you. Then how about Xianying?
Sure. I'd just like to
we go
echo
back.
Paul, and the point he made was, I think, very good, that we are not operating in some unknown domain. We're operating in one area of intellectual property, and we can frame it by what we know in that market. So I think that sometimes it's possible to get excited about the new implementation of a technology approach. So it was possible to get very excited about open source. It's possible to get very excited about open hardware. But it's not rewriting the rules of intellectual property. And it's not rewriting the rules of a market. It's evolving it. Now, open source software helped smaller companies gain access to bigger technology. We're seeing the same with open hardware. Now you don't have to rely on Intel or Qualcomm for your chips. You can begin to look at building on something like RISC-V. And of course, using an outsourced foundry like TSMC. So the market is changing, but it hasn't been taken apart. So we can use existing knowledge and existing approaches to frame what we do. The one caution I would have for open hardware, which touches on what all of our speakers have said, is that there will be a tension between platform and product. And there is an issue, perhaps, in open hardware that not necessarily enough time has been spent in the domain of patents and patent cross-licensing. In open source, we've done that for a long time. Licenses like Apache or GPL have very clear patent terms. Quite a few open hardware licenses appear to not really address the patent issue. But if you're dealing with innovation, you need to deal with issues like that. So a sign of maturity in this market will be clearly addressing that topic.
Okay. Thank you. Then, Mr. Ren, Ren 律师.
Yep. I think that one of the biggest advantages of open source development is how it can make facility around the world. However, because open source development is a global activity, it necessarily involves providing usable software or hardware across national borders. Export control regulation in some countries, such as the United States and also in China, additional stamps may be required to ensure that open source projects comply with their obligations under local law. So I think it's not clearly, in China, it's not very clearly about how to handle with open source hardware. And in China, the export control regulation is is not very developed. So it may be need some practice to make it more clear, and it's also a challenge to every company. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I also want to make some comments. As open source and patent, in fact, are derived from opposed ideas. That's the words from Cecilia's presentation. But in fact, both are born from the purpose of spreading technology to the public to make a better world. And from the viewpoint of strategic management, in fact, in my doctor program research, I focused on the strategic management of enterprises, how to make use of intellectual property. So from the viewpoint of strategic management, no wonder the intellectual property policy or the open source policy, they're just external environment. But for the private firms or the research institute, they just should make the use of the external environment and then make the use of the external resources to improve its own internal capability and then to earn its competitiveness in the industry. So each private company should make a judgment of the external environment and according to its own competitiveness and its own resource, and then to make the use of IP, make the use of open source, and then to gain its own competitiveness. During the process, I think each firm, each private firm, each research institute should pay attention to how to balance the IP policy, the IP system, and the open source system. And secondly, should pay attention to the compliance. And also, each firm should make a contribution. To the system, to the open source system, and also you should make contribution to the patent database. You do more, and then you will gain more. Okay, that's my comments. And the last part, I want to invite each guest to make a conclusive comments of this panel. Okay, then.
Okay, I'm happy. I cannot say the last conclusion, but I would add an additional comments. Today, we've talked about the classification, the patent protection, and some bars or how we can encourage the contribution of the technology to the public. But anyway, it's not a donation, it's a contribution. So we have to think about that, the balance between the business interests, the commercial beneficial, and the public interests. But I think in the future, we have another challenge besides the patent protection. That was the regulatory issues, not only the export control laws, but the data. Data will raise lots of the issues, not only the privacy, that's a law issue, but the security that mostly it's like the national security issues. Also, the lots of the issues, we don't know what will happen in the near future, but I guess we will, just like in the past, we have some weapon will raise the war, and then finance could be in a war, and the data can also be in a war as well. Who knows? So when we talk about the open source technology in the future, besides the IP bars, we have to consider about the data issues. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Then, Park.
Okay. So, I mean, some conclusions. I mean, one thing as a general point, I think there may be a temptation sometimes with open source to assume that patents are not your problem, that they don't need to be considered. But I would say do consider them, learn about them, understand them. They're not well understood as an IP right. Not, you know, they're much more complicated than some of the others. So understand them, understand how they can affect you and how you can use them as well. Consider them in your licenses, exactly as Shane says. Don't sweep them under the carpet. Think about filing your own. You know, think about how you can share them. Should there be some sort of pooling arrangement, or should there be some non-aggression pact, these kind of things, but think about them in the wider sense and think about the community.
Okay, thank you. Ning, Shine.
All right. So I just want to mention very briefly one point on open source. Open source is not about ignoring patents. On my board alone, we have companies like Qualcomm and Ericsson, some of the largest and most sophisticated patent holders in the world. Open source is about having a strategy around patents and knowing exactly where you're going to litigate. And I think to Paul's point, in open hardware, maybe the strategy is undefined. And companies haven't really worked that out. And I think Paul is correct that is something that has to be solved. It could be an awful mess if companies don't have consensus about how to manage patents and open hardware. You cannot ignore patents. But open source shows how you can manage incredibly large patent portfolios and open collaboration with surprisingly little friction, actually less than proprietary software. It doesn't happen by accident, though. It's conscious choices. To wrap up, I'd note that software is just software. Open source software is just a methodology of doing collaboration in certain contexts, just as proprietary software is just a methodology of doing product releases in certain contexts. It's all just software, and hardware is just hardware. Open hardware is just an approach for licensing and sharing some intellectual property. So we mustn't think that we're on separate islands, that we're doing something completely different. We're approaching a domain like hardware or software to enable collaboration for specific purposes. To do that, we have some rules and some boundaries. We just have to make sure those rules are clear and the boundaries are understood. Otherwise, we can't collaborate effectively.
I agree with you. Thank you. And then Mr. Ren, Ren 律师.
Okay. It's not it's not concluding, just some suggestion. I think that open source, whether software or hardware, is open out in the internet or in the. But if the software or hardware transferred from the board from one country to another country, I think we must to pay more attention on how it can comply with the local law. It's just a suggestion, not a conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I think it's really a banquet of fluent minds and thoughts. I really get much benefit from your information, from your suggestion. Thanks for your participation. Thanks for the organizer of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, everyone. I think the online session part is an end for today. So the rest of the part will be only like offline here. We will have our feedback session. 就我们接下来是那个反馈 feedback session， 我们就只是本地的线上的就可以下了。哎，你们线上就可以下了，把那视频。Thank you.